have some very strong opinions and ideas, and I think we'll probably state those opinions now.
Okay, I guess we should jump into this. How you doing this morning, Rio?
It's a Saturday and I'm alive, so that's fun. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've been trying to like read the news, but then I read the news and get frustrated, and then like, yeah. So we're here, and it's like, all right, cool. I did my research, got more depressed, and now we're here.
Yeah, I hear you. I spent the week also reading news, and I had planned on doing a bunch of videos, but then I read the news, and then I read the comment section, and we triggered a bunch of right-wing people who, oddly enough, so there was this one guy that left 2 comments on our page, and the first was accusing us of being paid by Mark Carney and being like CBC, I don't know, left-wing lunatics.
Yep.
And then I could tell he was watching our video because like exactly 5 minutes later, he left another complaint comment saying that we were trying to be edgy because we were also criticizing the liberals. And I was like, no, that's just being balanced.
Yeah, that's how you're supposed to do politics, right? Is you criticize not just one side, but both. And like,
yeah.
Also, I just want to mention, if you're getting the like sweet Mark Carney money, like I wouldn't be recording in a bedroom, right?
Right. I was like, I wish Mark Carney was paying me for this.
Yeah, if only.
Like, oh my God. That's a great segue too, because the first thing I want to do is complain about Mark Carney.
Yep.
So he's, as you know, he's pulling ahead further in the polls, and that's fine. But he's been taking some flack lately.
Yep.
So I don't know how much news you've been watching, but like Karina Gould, Chrystia Freeland, even Frank Bayless have been doing like, you know, Canadian media, US media. Chrystia Freeland has mostly been doing like US media, like really focusing on the tariffs, which we'll get into later. But Mark Carney has been like silent, like nothing. He did one CTV interview last week, but here's the crazy thing about this. He keeps going on BBC. And like, not even in a like promoting Canada kind of way, in a I'm speaking for Canada kind of way. Like they were like interviewing him about the tariffs, and he was commenting on like what we were going to do in retaliation. So I don't know. This is kind of rubbing me the wrong way, partially because like it's such a short period of time that like you kind of have to dual campaign, right? Like I think the others are doing it more because they know Carney's the guy to beat. So they kind of have to win over the public in order to win over the Liberal caucus, if that makes sense, right? To be like, no, guys, like I can win the Canadian public if you like vote me in, right?
Right.
But Carney is just like absent from everything unless you're Jon Stewart or the BBC, apparently. I don't know. Maybe I'm overreacting, but I am like absolutely getting rubbed the wrong way by this, and it's kind of pissing me off.
No, that's fair. For me, I did a quick Google search last night just to try and like find a little bit more information as to what's going on, because like I haven't been watching much Canadian news because the American news is frankly just a little bit more interesting.
The dumpster fire.
Yeah,
actually,
exactly.
I think it's spread from the dumpster.
Yeah, it's already down the street, but like, and all I could really find, like just doing like a couple of quick Google searches, like Mark Carney and like Mark Carney news and like Pierre Poilievre news, is like, well, just a whole bunch of articles being like, yeah, you know, Canadians think that Mark Carney would be better at negotiating with Donald Trump than Pierre Poilievre. And like, I couldn't find the direct polls. I just kind of found the articles talking about it. And I was like, I mean, I kind of see that. Like Mark Carney is like someone with a lot of like economic experience. That's someone we want, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, but yeah, you're right. I really haven't seen anything. And my intuition is like, he's just trying to create like within the party first, right? Because like, you know, dictator's handbook type of dealio, you want to focus on like the people that you need first, and then you kind of focus on like what it looks like outside of that. But you are right that like basically as soon as Parliament is back, we're probably staring down the barrel of another election. So like,
especially if Mark Carney wins.
yeah,
Like, there's no way. If Mark Carney wins, he's not doing a throne speech or opening parliament. He's calling an election on March 20th.
yeah.
And he's
So
not going to want to freaking deal with Jagmeet Singh.
yeah,
Like,
I mean,
oh, I need to negotiate with you. And which is funny. We'll get into this like in a couple minutes, but like, I'm kind of curious to see what Jagmeet's going to do too, because he's also tanking in the polls.
yeah. So like, we'll really see what happens. And like, I'm like, maybe what we talked about a little while ago, like between the two of us is right, where it's like, maybe we'll get to like March and then they'll be like the NDP will be like, oh no, we're just going to continue to back Mark Carney until October when the election's supposed to happen. We got 6 months of like a trial run, and then we get to see what happens, right?
Which actually would be really funny, because if we go back to that 1988 election,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was, somebody was talking about this. I think it was Power and Politics on CBC this week. They were talking about how like John Turner initially didn't have a seat as like a liberal leader. But I don't know. I can't see it with like all this trade war stuff that's going on with the US and Trump. Like, there's no way if Mark Carney wins that he can be an effective leader till October with no House seat. Like, I can't see that going over well with the Canadian people. Like, Pierre Poilievre will just keep screaming about how we have an unelected prime minister and how terrible that is.
Yeah.
And while he's not entirely wrong, it's also not a thing that hasn't happened before because of the way
Just the way the system is.
The system works, right? But like, I feel like it's just too important. Like, he's going to go in there and be like, no, we have to go to an election. And also, I don't want to deal with you, Jagmeet. I don't want to have to like negotiate with Donald Trump, deal with Poilievre being the loudmouth, obnoxious guy that he is, and have to appease your crazy ass policies right now. Right? So like,
yeah, it's really not.
Yeah.
It's not a good situation to be in. So you're probably right that we will end up just with an election. But I mean, it's also possible someone just steps down and there's just like by election, like in a very liberal friendly riding that just happens to be Mark Carney's, right?
Just happens to step down.
Yeah, just happens to step down at that moment.
Like in Medicine Hat.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God. Actually, this is a total pivot. Speaking of Medicine Hat, and it's totally not in the notes, but did you hear about the AHS inquiries this week?
Yes, I did, because I work in that sector. So.
Oh my God.
So do you want to give everyone the introduction? Because I work in it a little bit too closely, so I'm not sure where I'm allowed to like comment.
Yeah, we'll move past it and maybe we'll talk about it next week. But it's just like everything's just on fire right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's typical for Alberta. So
yeah, that's fair. But even like small YouTubers, like there's this one guy from Saskatchewan. All he's been talking about this week is Alberta, and it's really funny.
Yeah.
I'll link the story, guys, in the description for anybody that's interested in Alberta being on fire. Fun read. Naheed Nenji's pretty pissed off, which is hilarious. I don't think I've ever seen him actually like angry before. Usually his like big like I'm pushing back against Danielle Smith, like when she was going to the Trump inauguration, he was like, yeah, you know, initially I thought like good on her getting FaceTime with President Trump. And then he went into his like, you're dumb kind of thing. But like,
it's
he's
really
actually like really mad. It's interesting.
It's really interesting to see like the like happiest guy that I've seen in politics actually get mad, which is really bizarre. Because I remember I've actually met Naheed Nenji like on a few occasions, and like he's literally never remembered me, but I just think it's really funny that like every single time I met him, he's like, "Oh, it's so nice to meet you." You know, it's like such a like happy dude. And then like now I see him in like videos on like Instagram and YouTube. I was like just ranting basically about how mad he is at the government. I'm like, wow, I
took a class with him at Mount Royal, and the bastard only gave me an A-. I'm still pissed about it.
Only an A-, she said.
I am a perfectionist, and I wasn't very happy about it. Okay.
I mean, fair. Like, this is as someone like taking a whole bunch of courses online right now, and is like, will not settle for less than an A. So
exactly. Okay, let's pivot to our maybe future prime minister, who has seemingly switched his message. Thank God. I was tired of hearing about Axe the Tax. So now he has this new sign, Stop the Drugs. He also sometimes, I don't know if you've noticed this, he's been standing behind a Canada First sign and pushing populism. So like, that's fun. Let's take a listen to his reaction to the fentanyl crisis, and then we will chat about it.
On the proposed legislation
Oh,
for life for
there we go.
Kingpin dealers, what is your strategy for the notwithstanding clause? To use it at all, to use it preemptively, to see it play out through the courts?
What I'm proposing today is not only allowed under the Charter, it is required by the Charter. Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees life, liberty, and security of the person. 50,000 people had their Section 7 right to life violated by the open borders, soft on crime, legal drugs policy of the Liberals. I will protect the charter rights of Canadians and their right to life, liberty, and the security of the person by locking up the mass murderers that bring these drugs in. This penalty that I propose is proportionate to the crime. If you kill dozens of people, you should go away for life. And that is what we will do. I will lock up these fentanyl murderers and we will throw away the key. And I will do it not just to save lives, but to uphold the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
And then
En
that's
français.
an interesting use of Section 7, really innovative thinking there. But would you use 33 to insulate the law so it doesn't get backed down in court?
Oh, it won't. No, well, because the judges are going to be obliged by Section 7. It's clear that people have the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. So what I'm proposing is necessary to uphold the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And you do not have the right to go out and kill 20 or 30 people by spreading poison in the community. That is not a charter right. So the Liberals believe that mass fentanyl murderers who have taken 50,000 lives have the right to go free on the streets. That is how they interpret the Charter. Here's how I interpret the Charter. That law-abiding people have the right to expect that their children will not die in back alleys. That's the charter right I will uphold. Next question.
So Section 7 over Section 12.
En français.
Section 7 is the section in question.
Okay. So there's a lot to unpack there. So let's just start with, they didn't really give the backstory there. So basically, Poilievre's come out and said that if his government is elected, he will have minimum mandatory sentences of life sentences for anybody carrying and trafficking 40 milligrams of fentanyl or more.
Yeah.
And then if you're between 20 and 40 milligrams of fentanyl, it's a minimum mandatory sentence of 15 years. So to kind of examine this, we kind of got to go back. So I do find it interesting that he's immediately trying to back up his law with Section 7 of the Charter, because he would have been in the Harper government when Harper passed all of his tough on crime legislation.
Yep.
Now, that minimum mandatory sentencing was overturned by the Supreme Court of Canada, and they said, like, no, it's disproportionate to the crime. And so, like, one of the big backlashes was a minimum 4-year sentence for 4 pot plants in your house, which at the time was actually hilarious. I remember I had a friend who worked with a minister to actually pass that legislation because her daughter was actually molested by somebody in the family. And so when she worked with her MP, it was about like protecting children and increasing minimum mandatory sentences for those types of people.
Yeah.
And I remember she was like, I don't understand why you're so mad. Like, can you explain this law to me? And so I met her at a Starbucks, and I pulled out the list. Like in the bill, it had a list of what the law was and the sentences now and what it was under the legislation. So the minimum sentence for child, like interfering with a child, which is a crime under the sexual assault legislation, was 60 days house arrest. It increased to 90 days house arrest. And then they made a minimum mandatory sentence of 4 years for pot plants. I've never seen somebody turn on the conservatives so fast in my life. So that's just like a funny side story. But the point is, Poilievre was kind of around at the time this all happened. So I find it interesting that he's immediately trying to quash the minimum mandatory sentencing with Section 7 of the Charter.
Yeah.
So it will be interesting to see what judges do, because they don't like minimum mandatory sentences. They don't work for a number of reasons, especially with like, not to underplay fentanyl. Like fentanyl is very potent and can kill you. 20 milligrams is like, I looked it up and it was like enough to potentially kill 50 people, and like depending on like what it's cut with, etc. Right? So like that's true, and there needs to be some kind of punishment for like actual traffickers. But any judge will tell you that a lot of like street level guys are selling drugs to then keep their habit going. And so like if you stick them in, it's kind of a mess, and it's not like as black and white as he would like it to seem.
It's not really solving the problem long term, right? Because like, especially, you know, what was it? I think I read a CBC article a little while ago that like 2 milligrams is like on average a lethal dose of fentanyl, which like, so fair, carrying 20 to 40 milligrams is a lot, and you can, you know, do a lot of harm with that. But if you're, you know, if you're like small time user, like, and you get caught, let's say like 5 milligrams, right? You know, probably not for the purposes of trafficking, right? It's those larger quantities where you have that, like, oh yeah, you know, this guy's definitely trafficking fentanyl, like, and that's kind of where you want to start getting those things. But a mandatory minimum sentence doesn't stop them from doing it. It just
and the thing is too, right? Like, okay, so say you have like this guy that's got 20 milligrams of fentanyl and he's clearly a low-level dealer. The minimum mandatory is now 15 years. How are you going to get him to turn on the guys that are actually trafficking it? Like that's not going to be a thing. You're taking away literal tools that RCMP have to like.
You're getting rid of you're getting rid of the leverage you need to actually run a proper investigation. Because like, if you go into like, you know, if you go into an interrogation and you're like, okay, well, you know, I can't offer you anything in terms of like a lenient sentence because, sorry, mandatory minimum is 15 years. But
please tell us who your guy is.
If you think about it, though, it's not 25 years. So like, really, you're not missing out on that much time, right? Like that's you know, I'm past a certain point, any amount of time in prison is still just time you're spending in prison, right? So you're not going to get them to turn on like their suppliers or like, you know, with the manufacturers or whatever. You're just basically like hamstringing yourself. It's not an effective policy. And like, I think last time too, because of course I've already struck this down before, so it's probably likely that we'll see it come up again and we'll get struck down again, right? And you know, I wanted to mention this too, but like, you know, the interviewers were asking, you know, what about using Section 33? And Poilievre was like, oh no, they totally won't need to do it because the courts will be obliged to hold it up because of Section 7. And I'm not a legal scholar, but A, that's not how that works. Like, you know, I did an undergrad in law, and like that's just about as much knowledge as I have. I know that's not how that works. And B, like, you can still just invoke it. And for me, like, anyone talking about Section 33 just casually is like, they're probably thinking about doing it for other things, not just criminal law, right?
Well, it wasn't in that clip, but later he said that he would be open to using Section 33 to pass any of his criminal laws. But here's the other thing with that. At the federal level, it's supposed to be to override charter rights temporarily, not permanently. So it still doesn't like fix your problem. So like we saw this with the prostitution legislation that Harper also passed and also got struck down at the Supreme Court of Canada because it violated the Section 7 rights of people that work in sex work.
Yeah.
And so then he invoked Section 33, and then they gave him a year to fix the law. And then his fix was, oh, we'll just make it illegal to buy sex, not sell sex.
Yeah.
And then it had to like make its way back through the courts again. So that's like a really common thing. Yeah, it's so scary. Anytime like I have mixed feelings about Section 33 because you see what's happening. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but you see what's happening in the States. Could you imagine if Trump had a Section 33, like an Amendment 33? Like, he's now figured out where Canada is. I don't want him like looking at our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and being like, hey, this Section 33 thing is kind of interesting. We should make a constitutional amendment. Because it does like basically give you the right to like pass any laws.
Rights and freedoms, right? And so I have very strong opinions on it. I'm very strongly of the opinion that it was a mistake, but it was basically like, it was a clause that was included to get the provinces on board going into ratifying the 1982 Constitution, which is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? And like, I'm very strongly of the opinion it was a mistake because it's so easy to just abuse. And like, it has been abused in the past. And like, anyone who just kind of casually brings it up, I'm very strongly of the opinion it's like, no, they're not just thinking about like one thing. They're thinking about everything that they could possibly get away with using it for, right?
Yeah.
And like, I remember I wrote a paper again during my undergrad, my first one, where I was like, yeah, no, like now that I've read the notwithstanding clause a couple of times, this shouldn't have been included. Because you now have this system where, yeah, you have rights and freedoms insofar as whatever government that's currently in power feels like you deserve those, right? Then all of a sudden you can just shut it down and you don't really have those rights and freedoms anymore. So like, if I suddenly like say, it's like, oh yeah, you have mobility rights. I want to move to like, just random province, Nova Scotia, I really like lobster, right? All of a sudden, if like one government was like, nope, we got to protect Halifax and I can't move, I'm going to be pissed. I love lobster, right?
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing, specifically with minimum mandatory sentences, they've been proven over and over and over again not to deter the actual crime, right? Like if that was a thing, the US wouldn't see as much murder as it does because they have the death penalty. Like it just doesn't. It's just not a deterrent. So it really bothers me. Like if you want to be like, I want to punish people, just fucking say, I want to punish people. Don't like try to pretend it's some big like deterrent of crime. And then of course, on the other side of this is minimum mandatory sentences have also been proven over and over again to disproportionately affect marginalized communities, particularly in Canada, Indigenous people. In the US, we see it disproportionately impact African Americans. So like, it's just all kinds of messy. And I'm not saying I'm not for tougher laws on fentanyl trafficking right now. But like, you have to do it in a way that complies with the courts and ensures that you're actually going to start picking away at the problem, not just throwing a whole bunch of low-level dealers in prison and calling it a day and being like, I locked up 20 dealers last week. Okay, well, they just put 40 more on the streets. Did you actually get a name? Oh, no, you didn't, because you had nothing to bargain with, because that's how our justice system works. 95% of cases are pled out for lower sentences, either because people know, oh crap, they have a lot of evidence and I did that crime, so I should probably plead, or because, oh crap, I'm an Indigenous person and that jury's probably going to be all white, so I should probably take this deal so that I don't get like 15 years. Like, I could go on and on about this, but it just really pissed me off that instead of talking about policies on how he's going to deal with Trump and how he's going to deal with like the housing crisis, he went off on the
like this
drugs are like drugs are bad, okay?
Yeah, which
Fuck
like
off.
yeah, and I'm with you. Like, I'd love to see like stricter penalties for those like higher, for higher level people, like people in the system. But at the same time, you're not addressing like the issue of supply and demand, where like there's a demand for the product that's being supplied. How you're going to cut down that supply, or how you're going to cut down the demand to really get rid of the problem, right? Like
Yeah.
you get rid of a low level dealer, you got rid of a low level dealer. Someone who maybe carries like an ounce. And like, oh wait, sorry, I'm still thinking like when weed was illegal. Like, but someone who carries like a small amount to deal that small amount just to like, basically make a little bit of cash on the side, or like maybe that's just their job, and they're not really like they're not providing as much as they like the people they're buying from, right?
Mm.
So like, you're not really doing anything to address the actual problem of like, well, now you have organized crime involved. How are you going to get rid of that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but just saying I'm going to put them in jail forever is a good political move. So
yeah, it's easy to digest and people understand it, right? And that's what makes it a good political move. But like at the same time, it's also awful politics because you're not fixing the actual problem.
yeah. Okay, let's move on to tariffs. So as you probably heard, we almost had tariffs, and then miraculously on Monday afternoon, Trump announced that Canada was able to negotiate their way out of tariffs until March 1st, which is hilarious because he said there was nothing we could do to get out of the tariffs.
And then all of a sudden there was.
Yeah. Okay, so this whole thing just annoys the shit out of me. And I'm trying to, okay, maybe we should start with like what Trudeau actually said he was going to do. Which is hilarious in itself because none of this is new stuff, and most of this was actually announced last year. And so basically Trudeau played Trump. But he told Trump that we were committed to $1.3 billion to disrupt fentanyl trade, which included things like handheld chemical analyzers, x-rays, handheld x-ray machines, troops on the border, tighter coordinations with U.S. agencies, etc. Also to purchase new drones and 2 Black Hawk helicopters, also announced early January. The only 2 things he gave him, which were new, was cartels are now being categorized as terrorist organizations in Canada. Okay. Whatever, I guess. It could have political implications with Mexico, but I think Mexico has bigger fish to fry at the moment. And then, did you hear about this? The fentanyl czar?
Yes, I've heard about that. And this is just me being like, sounds suspiciously like Russian influence. But like, I find it strange that we're using the term czar casually again, right? Like, and rather alarming that we're using the term czar casually again. So
language matters.
yeah.
So they'll be hiring this person, and then $200 million will be invested into intelligence. And their whole job, from what I can understand, is going to be basically to come up with a plan to target organized crime, specifically the fentanyl networks. So like, I don't know, it's probably going to be some high level RCMP officer that gets this position because
Why? Who else would it be? Right?
But then there's a lot of talk about why this is happening, right? Like, because it's not about the border. He's just using that as an excuse. Our officials obviously won't come out and say that unless you're Justin Trudeau getting hot mic'd. Did you hear about that?
Yes, I did.
So even like I actually, in prep for this, I was trying to find like a specific clip of Freeland, which I'll play at the end of this. But she was on one of the morning shows on MSNBC, Joe and somebody, I can't remember the other girl's name. They were the ones that like went to Mar-a-Lago to like bow down to Trump, and they got like a whole bunch of backlash. But she was on there, and they asked her, well, like, what do you think's going on? And she just like flat out was like, oh, no. I am not getting into that. You're Americans, you figure it out. But, and we'll get into this more in the American section, but he favors McKinley. He wants to take over the Arctic, which we're going to talk about next week. He wants to annex Canada, which he won't shut up about. And for those of you that didn't hear, Justin Trudeau was caught hot mic'd yesterday telling a bunch of business leaders that, oh yeah, no, he's dead serious, in case you couldn't tell from the like every 5 minutes that he brings it up. Which I don't know why the media went so hard at him. Like, it's not a secret. We all know this.
We all know.
Right? Like, he wants to take Panama, the Panama Canal, and now he's going to turn Gaza into a resort. So like, it's clear these tariffs are there to fund imperialism. Oh, and his new sovereign wealth fund. Did you hear about that?
I heard about it. I haven't done the reading on it yet.
Yeah. Well, basically he wants to establish a sovereign wealth fund where they can like invest the money to build capital for what he says will be like infrastructure and that kind of crap, right?
Infrastructure.
Of course, like about that did a really great piece on like what sovereign wealth funds look like around the world. And really the only one that's been successful was I want to say Denmark, but I think that's wrong. What's that other country that has like mass amounts of oil?
I mean, that could describe so many countries.
I know. Why can't I remember? Anyway, there's one country that like basically funds their entire sovereign wealth fund with oil money. I think it's Denmark, but I might be wrong. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is they don't have money to put in it. The US is trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in debt. But if they have tariffs, and he's talking about tariffing the EU now, and he wants to impose just like a blanket tariff on everything coming into the US.
Yeah.
So essentially, he's going to have his people
fund his
imperialistic, I'm going to rebuild Gaza with resorts fund.
Yeah.
This should scare the shit out of everyone.
Yeah. So
like,
oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I'm so annoyed. I have nothing else to.
Yeah. No, that's fair, because I just wanted to talk about my favorite book, The Dictator's Handbook. And like, so with tariffs, especially, like they're a political tool, right? And in this case, they're a political tool that just happens to suck wealth out of your own country by making it so expensive to buy anything that comes into that country, right? Like the consumer pays the tariff. It's something that's been pretty easily and like commonly established. The problem though is that like tariffs are also a tool to use against other countries, to kind of bully other countries into getting the policy concessions you want. And the United States has, the world's largest GDP at almost 29 trillion now, while Canada's is just about 2.25 trillion. So like, it's clearly not equal. So you can very easily be like, well, the US is going to tariff Canada, and Canada's going to take an enormous hit. The US is basically going to make a dent in like what their, balance sheet looks like at the end of the day. So like, you can use those kinds of tools to minimize the likelihood of like an actual hot conflict. And we can talk more about that later. But it still is extremely alarming that we have a president who's now talking about, taking over allied nations just for the sake of, in this case, rare minerals, right?
Right. Sorry, while you were saying that, I was just remembering, I pulled up, where are you? I pulled up a interview that Chrystia Freeland gave, talking exactly about this. Can you see that? It's just showing you for some reason.
No. Also, I pulled up the Wikipedia page on sovereign wealth funds. It's Norway you were thinking about.
Norway, yeah. They have just a massive one. I knew it wasn't Denmark. They have just a massive one on oil, and it's all funded off oil.
Yeah.
Alberta used to have, as another example, a good heritage fund.
Heritage Fund, yeah.
The Heritage Fund before the Conservatives spent it all.
Yeah.
Oh, that's too bad. It won't come up. But no, she basically gave an interview where Steve from MSNBC was saying like, well, there's this big trade deficit between Canada and the US. Like, how is this fair? Like, do you agree with Trump that that it's unfair? And she was like, no, you guys should be happy that you have a reliable source to get your needs from. And the only reason there's any kind of deficit is because of energy.
Yep.
You use so much energy that you have to buy your oil and your electricity from us.
Yeah.
If you'd like, you can go to Venezuela. Let us know how that works out.
Yeah, let us know how the non-functioning government country of the country works, right? Like
Exactly.
I also think there's something to be said about like a country of 400 million people is obviously going to use and like buy a lot more than a country of 40 million people, right? Like you're talking about deficits, but you're not talking about the relative, like the fact that just relatively your population is that much bigger than ours. So like there's a lot of stuff that contributes to the fact that there's a trade deficit, and you have a really reliable partner in Alberta who can supply you with oil and gas, and like a really reliable partner in Ontario and Quebec who can supply you with electricity at like a really good rate. So like, you know, why pick the fight?
Yeah, right. It's just insane. And then she like, what I thought was really funny was at the end of that interview, she was like, look, if you're gonna like kick us, we're gonna punch you in the face. Like, which is really the only reason I wanted to play that. But since that doesn't work, I'm gonna show, just to close this out, her plea to Americans in an interview she gave to CNN. She was talking about, right before what I'm gonna play, she was talking about how like Canadians have gone from like being sort of passive and just like slightly upset about it to being like so pissed they were booing the American anthem at hockey games and basketball games last week. And so then in her plea, she gave like the most, I understand why Trump hates her, because she has the most like mom condescending voice I've ever heard in my life. And yeah, so I'm gonna play this clip. I don't know if you saw this at all, but like good old Seth Meyers.
To make matters worse, Canada immediately responded with retaliatory tariffs and harsh words for Americans.
Americans have to understand how hurt and frankly how furious Canadians are. Regular Canadians across the country are coming up with ways to stand for Canada, to fight for Canada, to defend Canada, but mostly to say to our American neighbors, guys, just cut it out. Just stop it. This is a terrible idea.
I think Canadians are.
Yeah, it's like so just like disappointed mom voice, right?
Right? Like
I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed.
Yeah, like, and of course that's been like sort of the butt of like every late night show this week, and I want to clip it and get a button. Guys, cut it out. But yeah, it's insane. Which she, like, to her credit, like she did in that same interview, and basically every interview she's done on American TV, she's basically said, like, why are you people insane?
Yeah.
Like, you rely on us just as much. Like, Trump just last week was talking about how, like, our dairy laws are super unfair, and
because we don't allow American imports, right?
Yeah, right. And so, like, two things there. First off, he said that he doesn't need us, but now he's saying he needs our like 30 million people in Canada to have access to their dairy over their like what 500 million people. Now, don't get me wrong. I agree with Trump. I would love to be able to get my hands on some Kerrygold butter from Ireland because it is like the best butter on the planet, but our like mafia dairy laws keeps other dairy out of our country. So like, he's not wrong, but I do find it funny that he's like, we don't need you for anything, but also let our subpar dairy into your country.
Yeah, I actually have a funny story. So I had a professor while I was at the U of C, and he was former aide to Stephen Harper, and it was a really funny thing that he mentioned. He was like, I had a really interesting like experience while I was in that role. Because every time we went to like a political event, there's always someone from like the Dairy Farmers Union sitting beside me. And I never quite understood why until one day he asked like one of the representatives from the Dairy Farmers Union, he's like, hey, like I just met another guy from your organization. What's going on here? And they're like, oh yeah, it's my job to make sure that there's always at least one dairy farmer sitting next to you at every single event. So like you just talked about a dairy mafia. We literally have a dairy mafia influencing government, and it's really funny to think about. Like, I don't know, it's funny, and like looking back, I'm like, man, really, that's how politics works, isn't it? You just sit beside the people and talk to them. But
that's the same political science professor who will go unnamed that always starts the first class he has with, "Yes, I'm that insert name here."
Yep. That is him.
Yeah,
It was him. It was the best. And like he was the best professor I had. He was hilarious. I love him. But yeah, it was just one of those moments where like when he told me that story, I was like, man, what a weird world we live in. But
yeah, but it's true, right? Like you do not screw with dairy.
You don't mess with dairy in Canada. Like,
It's the lobby is real from there.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's move right along into I wanted to talk about polls, because I'm finding this super interesting right now. So we're going to ignore the Ecos poll because, like, okay, buddy.
yeah, it's a little bit too different.
Here's what we call, listeners, an outlier. So anybody that's listening on audio only, I've pulled up a graph, which I stole from Power and Politics from CBC, of the Ecos, Ledger, Nanos, Ipsos, and Abacus. I think I said that right. Polls from the last month. And so it's before Justin Trudeau announced he was going to drop out. The Conservatives early December had were almost at 50. Which is insane. Like we didn't even see those numbers during the Harper years. And Harper was also super popular. It was kind of a similar situation. There was like scandals, blah, blah, blah. In Canada, our prime ministers tend to stay for like, a decade. Like look at John Chrétien.
Yep.
He was in power for like 12 years.
Yep.
And people that want power shouldn't have power, and ultimately shit goes to their heads, and then they do things like fire their finance ministers over Zoom. Which that story came out this week too. I don't know if you saw it, but apparently Justin Trudeau fired Chrystia Freeland over Zoom, and it like wasn't an actual resignation. So that's a fun little fact, and no wonder she went totally nuclear on his ass.
Yeah.
But the reason I wanted to talk about this is because after Trudeau announced his resignation, we started seeing this slow, again, ignore this Ecos one, but we started seeing this like slow decline in Conservative support. And like I said last week, like I don't want to give too much into polls because as we saw in 1988, trade elections are completely different and this stuff means crap. But there are a couple interesting things. So the first thing is that in December, they were at 50% support.
Yeah.
Now they're just sitting at 41%. Liberals are at 28%. So that's still like a 12-point split. But when you're talking about like a 50-point split from just like a month ago, that's a lot.
Yeah.
But what's interesting here is I think we're starting to see an ABC approach.
Yeah.
Because that support appears to be coming for the moment from the NDP. And here's something else super interesting that's happening. The Bloc. So I was watching Good Talk this week, and there's a French journalist that's a panelist on that show every week. I just love her because she's just a typical French person that's like, no, you're wrong. And this is why you're wrong. But she, for weeks, has been talking about how much Quebec hates Poilievre.
Yeah.
Which should be of no surprise. He's obnoxious. He hates the media. He's attacked French media. And like, you don't do that in Quebec because Quebecers see the French media as like who's advocating for them in the rest of Canada.
Yeah.
So what happened was people in Quebec that don't vote conservative tend to kind of like go between liberal and bloc. And she said what we're seeing in Quebec is suddenly with Mark Carney, they're seeing liberals as a choice again.
Yeah.
So Bloc's polls are kind of tanking. The NDP polls are tanking, and those points seem to be swaying back to liberals. And I just wanted to bring this up because it'll be really interesting to see if Mark Carney, who again, remember, was backed by Stephen Harper in 2008 during the financial crisis, does get the lead. But the other interesting part here is once there was like, I tried to find the poll she was talking about and I couldn't find it, but she was saying last week, one of these places did a poll in Quebec where it was like this, where they were talking just about like liberals in general. But then they went to the public and said, okay, what if Mark Carney wins? And she was saying that like the Bloc poll just like completely tanked and pretty much disappeared. And the NDP like cut in half. And then that brought the Liberals to basically like even with the Conservatives. Now, why this matters is because Quebec has 64 seats in Parliament. So like that's quite the swing. And then if the Liberals can get Ontario on their side too, which is in the middle of an election itself right now. And historically, what's fascinating in Ontario, and again, trade war, so kind of norm's going to be out the window, but let's look at history for a minute. Ontarians tend to do the exact opposite federally that they do provincially. It's really weird if you watch them. So I'm going to be kind of interested to see, like, do they elect Doug Ford again? They probably will because he's relying on the whole, like, I stood up to Trump thing. Although historically calling an early election also doesn't tend to go very well with people. So we'll see. We saw that with Ed Stelmach in Alberta. He called an election and then got like completely obliterated.
Yep, which is how we got
our 4 whole years of NDP.
Yeah, our 4 whole years of NDP rule under Rachel Notley. Yeah,
where
which
they
was
destroyed the province.
Like it's just it's crazy. Like it's crazy to me that people are like, oh yeah, election, and like that's actually probably why Danielle Smith didn't call an election as soon as she like came in.
100%.
Like because she knew like, well, Jason Kenney's currently really unpopular. The party's currently really unpopular. Probably not the best idea, right? But yeah, she probably took that lesson from Stelmach very personally. And I feel like you're right? Like we'll see is like when we actually get into the election, that's when it'll change, and that's when we'll actually see what happens. But like the fact that people see Mark Carney as like such a strong alternative, like even this, like especially in Quebec, which as of I just pulled up the Wikipedia page again because I wanted to check the numbers. They have 78 seats. Like that's huge chunk.
Oh yeah, because I was just looking at the Conservative seats.
Yeah, so it's 78 seats total, and like. Between that and Ontario, really can form government between just those two. So if you think about it, if he does well enough in those 2 provinces, we probably would end up with like at least a minority liberal government.
Well, what's really interesting about the whole Mark Carney thing is, what did she say? I don't want to misquote her, but it was basically something to the effect of an adult has now entered the picture. And even though he sucks at speaking French, Quebecers see him as an actual alternative now to Poilievre, because I think one of the things the Conservatives need to rein him in on if they want to win is Quebecers don't like Poilievre, at least not like the people he's going to have, he has. Like they're not going to move that much, but then there is a chunk. Exactly. But like in Quebec, there's like a chunk of seats that have just kind of always like they're conservative. And then there's another chunk of seats where it's like liberal voters or bloc voters that have like moved over, kind of similar to like the rest of Canada right now. And if they want to hang on to those seats, I think they need to figure out how to make Poilievre less obnoxious. Like, for example, yesterday Globe and Mail ran a story where the headline was literally Pierre Poilievre has a super weird and creepy angry video release instead of talking to reporters. That was like basically the headline. They called him weird and creepy. I didn't watch it because I was reading it at like 2:00 this morning and Rob was sleeping, my husband. And I thought he'd be really mad if he woke up to like Pierre Poilievre screaming. Fair enough. Like I wouldn't want to wake up to that either. I occasionally fall asleep listening to like my political podcasts. And if Michael Cohen happens to be in my like watch list, there's been like several times where I've woken up at like 3 a.m. to like Michael Cohen screaming in my ear about like for the like 10th time about how like Trump screwed him, even though like he made his own decisions and supported a dictator for 10 years. But yeah, no, I think it's just like really interesting how Quebec could go. And I think it's just like worth watching to see what happens there.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like, and Quebec decides elections. And I just like to reiterate this because it's fun. At one point, the Bloc did form the official opposition of Canada. Right. So like, not saying that that's likely to happen, just kind of based on polling, it seems extremely unlikely. But the fact that like they see Carney as like such a strong alternative to Poilievre, who there's like so much distaste for, like, I think it's interesting. I think we'll see a very interesting election. Terrifying, but interesting.
Yeah, yeah, it's going to be not great.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I was distracted for a second because I was trying to find some video for our next story. Did you hear about the El Salvador thing?
I did not, but catch me up.
Oh, okay. So Marco Rubio went to El Salvador to talk about like migrants and strike a deal because they wanted to like deport people. And El Salvador floated a plan to send U.S. prisoners and citizens to the El Salvadorian prison system.
I mean, just Gitmo 2.0. Like,
okay, we'll get to Gitmo in a minute. But I want to share here. Sorry, I was just trying to find it. Is this it? Yeah. Here is El Salvadorian prisons. Oh, I'm trying to like hit play on the wrong screen.
The Trump administration and El Salvador's president Nayib Bukele said that they have allowed the U.S. to send detained migrants and imprisoned criminals to the Central American nation.
He has offered to house in his jails dangerous American criminals in custody in our country, including those of U.S. citizenship and legal residence.
President Donald Trump said,
so I'm going to take you to showing. Yeah, here we go.
What
these prisons look like.
Authoritarian fight against crime. In heavily publicized videos, inmates in boxer shorts are forced to go into the yards and sit nearly on top of each other. Bukele's crown jewel of incarceration is a mega prison called Terrorism Confinement Center. It opened in 2023. More than 84,000 people have been arrested since 2022 amid a crackdown against gangs in El Salvador. At least 12,000 of them were sent to this mega prison outside El Salvador's capital. The center can hold 40,000 inmates in cells for up to 70 prisoners. In there, prisoners do not receive visits, and they are never allowed outside.
Yeah, so the El Salvadorian prison system has been the talk of like human rights violations for years.
Yeah, as it should be, because that looks awful, right?
Yeah. So then here's a couple more clips that I think is worth watching before we have a conversation about this. So here's Trump. Well, being Trump, because of course.
take the shooters, the people that hit old ladies in the back of the head with a baseball bat when they're not looking, that walk down the street, the people that you see it, the people that take out a gun and shoot you for no reason at all. If we could get these animals out of our country and put them in a different country under the supervision of somebody that made a relatively small fee to maintain these people, because you know what? These are criminals. You call them hardened criminals. They've been in jail 40 times. There's one 42 times. And every time the person gets out, it's a he. Every time he gets out, he commits another crime within 24 hours. And it's a heinous crime. It's a rough crime. We don't want these people in our country either. We don't want them in our country. If we had the option to get them out and let them be based in some other country at a fraction of the cost, and frankly, they could keep them because these people are never going to be any good.
Jeez. Like,
Okay,
I'm not surprised.
so that's the US president advocating for prisoners to a dictatorship country where, yes, a lot of the prisoners are gangs, but if you start looking into this, and we're going to talk about this at the end, this is very much people have gone missing that have spoken out against the El Salvadorian leader.
Yeah.
I'm going to show one more clip because I think it's really relevant to this conversation before we chat, and that is Marco Rubio giving his like speechy thing about this. And listen closely to the extraordinary act of friendship part.
En directo desde Casa Presidencial en Zapote.
That's an offer President Bukele made. Obviously, we'll have to study it on our end. There are obviously legalities involved. We have a constitution. We have all sorts of things. But it's a very generous offer. No one's ever made an offer like that. And to outsource at a fraction of the cost, at least some of the most dangerous and violent criminals that we have in the United States.
Talk about removing Nicaragua from CAFTA.
We've issued a waiver today because in Costa Rica we have a trusted partner and an ally who has proven that they have taken aid from the United States and used it to fix a problem, to help us, to do it in a way that actually helps the United States. They're stopping drugs. They're stopping criminals. They're identifying terrorists. This is foreign aid that furthers the national interest. Other programs we have questions about. And but we've also issued waivers because we don't want anybody see anybody die or anybody be harmed in the short term.
Thank you for everyone who's been.
So that happened.
I mean, I just find it insane that like it's just regular conversation. I was like, yeah, let's just deport U.S. citizens to a foreign country for detainment, right? Like,
so
that's
much
not something you normally do.
Do you think they're going to get their parole hearings in, what's this place called? El Salvadorian mega prison? Terrorism Confinement Center, which has been criticized for severe overcrowding, starvation, abuse, and torture.
Yeah.
And the report, and I quote, enforced disappearances. So that was the part I was talking about where like, the president of El Salvador's opponents have just like, we don't know where they are.
What happened? Ooh, right? And that's a very common feature in autocracy, right? Like it happened in Argentina, and there's still like people missing, and they still don't know what happened to them. So like, who knows? But yeah, this is like
deporting US. Oh, and they struck a deal as well. This is really important. They struck a deal where El Salvador will also take deportations of any nationality. Now that's really important because El Salvador has agreed, much like Gitmo, which is going to be our next topic of conversation, they will take undocumented migrants into their system. What the fuck?
Yeah. I mean, like prisons are already notorious for slave labor. This is just another way to like get more free slave labor, right? Like, you know, you have undocumented people who go into a country, get deported now to El Salvador, probably like probably not their country, and they're stuck in the mega prison with 70 other people in a cell. Like, yeah, this is insane.
A sitting US president has said, I will send US citizens
Abroad for detainment.
abroad to
Under
their
autocracy.
country. But like, let's pretend it's fine. Let's pretend we're okay with him sending the worst of the worst there. Do you think it'll stop there?
No. And like that's the thing, right? Like it never stops with this kind of transition. Like it never stops, right? Like you can't really, once the floodgates are opened, you can't really like close them unless there's like a very solid and often violent reason to stop doing it, right? So like if you're sending your own people to another country to be detained and undocumented migrants and just anyone you don't really like that's another hallmark of autocracy. Like take a look at Russia. As soon as Navalny returned, he was imprisoned, and he stayed in prison for several years until he died, where he was poisoned by the Russian government, right? Like this can't in any way be seen as a good policy or like a good thing for American citizens, because now you're under threat of like, yeah, you know, I'm just gonna get stuck in an El Salvadorian terrorist prison. Sounds good to me, right? No one's gonna say that.
I'm just like, I really, and like, again, we're going to talk about this at the end. And I hate, one of the things that I really dislike is when people start equating everything to Hitler, because it like devalues like the seriousness of that.
Yeah.
However, Hitler came for the disabled. Then he came for the Ukrainians, which, by the way, Rob's Ukrainian grandfather was like super racist his whole life. And right before he died, I found out it was because he hated that the Jews were always like the ones that got like all the sympathy for concentration camps. And he was like, my people was in concentration camps. Where's all the talks about the Ukrainians in concentration camps? So I was just like, really? This is like why you're racist? But like divide and conquer, right? First they came for the disabled. Nobody gave a shit. Then they came for the Ukrainians. Nobody gave a shit. Then they came for the very large Jewish population.
Yeah.
Trump has gone for DEI. Then he went for trans people. Then he went for women in the military. We're going to talk about this more in a minute, but I didn't put this story in, so I'll talk about it now. There was just yesterday or the day before, they fired a general in the US military, and she was living in like military housing, because of course she was. They gave her 3 hours to vacate her house. Trump fires general. 2 weeks. Coast Guard, a Coast Guard commander. Here we go. I'll pull this up. So they gave her 3 hours to leave her house, and she had to like, nobody knows where she is right now. Apparently she's like, why isn't my sharing working today? Oh my God. Can you see this?
Yep.
There we go. So they gave her 3 hours. Then she had to hire like people to basically like move her out of the house. And he cited that it was because cited border security issues and an excessive focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion among the reasons for her dismissal. So this was a woman who was targeted because she had DEI initiatives within the Coast Guard, and he got rid of her.
Yeah. a high
because
ranking,
that was
like,
easy.
yeah, a high ranking official too, right? And like,
yeah, like the person in charge. So then they came for women in the military.
Yeah.
Where does this stop?
Yeah, like, and it's
Like,
that
when
classic,
are people going to give a shit? And that's like what we're going to get into next.
yeah, but it's that classic quote of like, first they came for whatever, I didn't speak up. Then they came for da-da-da, I didn't speak up, until eventually they come for me and no one was there to speak for me, right? Like,
well, who's on this list? Women, military personnel, generals. Last week we talked about how he's like trying to off his political opponents by taking away their Secret Service escorts. He took away Biden's security clearance. Like, Christ. Migrants, transgender people of color. Like, I don't know. I'm so angry, like, just watching this happen.
Yeah, and we'll get more into this later, but it's like it's the dismantling of a system that is what made America so successful, right? Like, and we'll also talk about how like this is a purge very specifically being done for a very specific reason. But we can talk about that after Gitmo. So do you want to let us on to Gitmo?
Yeah, let's talk about Gitmo for a second. So, Gitmo, yay. Okay, let me see if my share's gonna work again. These work. There we go. Trump first floated this idea, I don't know, what, a week or two ago? A week now? I can't even keep track at this point. He wants to utilize Guantanamo Bay, which will now be called Gitmo because I struggle saying that word. He signed an executive order instructing the Department of Defense and Homeland Security to prepare facilities to detain up to 30,000 migrants. They were going to put a tent community on the golf course.
Can't have that. It'll ruin the view.
It's poor military personnel.
Yeah.
Where are they going to golf? And on February 4th, 2025, which was a couple days ago now, we're recording on Saturday, February 8th, they sent their first migrant flight to Guantanamo Bay, which had 10 people on flight who were suspected of being in a Venezuelan gang. So, like, bad, yes, but they sent them to a terrorist prison camp.
Yeah.
Could you imagine being like the terrorists that are in there? I think there's like, when I looked it up, there was like 8 terrorists or suspected terrorists being held in Gitmo. Could you imagine like being one of them and being like, what is happening?
Yeah. Why do I suddenly have more cellmates and neighbors? But
who are these people? And can we like recruit them?
Yeah. I don't think that's thought about enough too, where it's like, prisons are where gang recruitment tends to happen, right?
But it gets better. So Pam Bondi, you may have heard, was confirmed this week.
Yep.
She shut down the white collar fraud division of the DOJ. And this division spent a lot of time like recovering money and stuff. Instead of returning the money to like, I don't know, victims of crime, she shut down the white collar fraud division, diverted all the money that was currently there, including collections of like victims of crime stuff, and the money used like to like for personnel and stuff on that division, and diverted it to upgrade Guantanamo Bay.
Priorities, right? Like
15 prisoners. I wrote it down. There's 15 prisoners. Plus now these 10 others. So 25 prisoners.
25 total. Yeah.
And they plan on filling it with another
30,000.
29,920 people. What the fuck?
Yeah.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth suggested this week.
Hegseth.
Yeah.
My fucking favorite guy.
That they could use the golf course and repurpose it to accommodate an additional tent detainees for up to another 6,000 migrants. So I'm currently as you know, I've been researching and filming a mini web series on Guantanamo Bay. The dark history and torture that happens in this prison. And we're going to send undocumented immigrants.
Yep.
And like, first they're starting with like gang members, which, like, again, don't get me wrong, bad. They should be in prison, but in a torture facility.
Yeah. And like, it's a torture facility that's also notorious for, that has like literally been notorious for its human rights violations and use of like waterboarding, right? Which like, for those unfamiliar,
under Democratic and Republican presidents.
yeah. Which
There was
like
some bad shit that happened under Obama there.
Yeah. And for those unfamiliar, waterboarding, like in waterboarding, you literally die and then you come back to life, right? Like it's a form of
Well, they
torture.
drown you over and over and over.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's an awful, awful form of torture. And like, you know, the fact that we're just now being like, oh, we'll just send these people there and, you know, 30,000 migrants. And if it's undocumented people, these are people that like can go missing and no one will know, right? So like, A, massive human rights violation, and B, like, you know, I always like, I have to try and remind myself these days that like, there are like, people are still people, right? Like I can get frustrated, but I can still be like, nope, you're a person, and therefore you are afforded the respect and courtesy of like, I will treat you as a person, right? Even though I get mad. But like, you know, you can't just deprive people of that because, you know, they're an undocumented migrant. You don't like them. They're, you know, a gang member or whatever, right? That's a gang member should be in prison. That doesn't necessarily mean they should be waterboarded.
In terrorist prison?
Yeah, in a terrorist prison being waterboarded, like, no. Sit right with anyone. That doesn't sit right with me, right?
It shouldn't sit right with anyone. So let's review. He's come for women in the military, trans people, LGBTQ people, criminals, all groups he can get away with.
Yep.
Let's watch. Okay, so this next section is where we're going to like really get into a bunch of this, but I'm going to, because I don't know how much you've seen this week. So and for our listeners as well, I'm going to fire off kind of a bunch of stuff here and sort of explain what's been happening. And then we can talk about the crazy, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, cool. Okay, so Seth Meyers put together kind of a really good look at some of the stuff, and then I'll move on to some news articles, and we'll get to listen to Marco Rubio talk again, which I apologize in advance. So let's watch this.
What would you call this?
The Trump team promised shock and awe to start his second term. 2 weeks in, the shocks keep coming.
Administration officials have forced out all 6 of the FBI's most senior executives and multiple heads of various FBI field offices.
Trump fired at least 17 inspector generals.
More than 24 federal prosecutors who worked on January 6 cases were fired.
Sparking panic inside the Bureau by people who fear retribution by the Trump administration.
More than 1,000 senior civil workers and contractors were fired, furloughed, or placed on leave. USAID's website has been offline for more than 24 hours.
Putting a pause on most federal government websites.
The Department of Education, a number of people have been placed on administrative leave.
Several federal agencies were instructed to remove pronouns and, in some cases, nicknames from their email signatures.
Immigration and Customs Enforcement reported an undisclosed number of arrests in Chicago, with the acting Deputy Attorney General, the Trump ally, Dr. Phil.
President Donald Trump did order water released from 2 dams in the Central Valley,
claiming more water would have helped with the LA wildfires, wasting reservoir supplies that farmers will need later. The water was released into rivers that do not flow to Los Angeles.
I thought you were just going to lower the price of eggs.
Okay, I may have let that go on purpose.
No, that's totally fair, because I definitely have like seen the fucking releasing the water shit. Like, didn't know that happened, but I knew about the rest of the removals and all that, and I have a lot of discussion notes on that. So
yeah. So hold off for a minute. Yes. So the water thing. We all know that Trump's been on about like if everything was just wetter, the fires wouldn't have been as bad. That shit. So he literally ordered that they release billions of gallons of water from their dams into like they were saying, rivers that don't even run to LA.
Yeah.
And now these dams are empty. The best part about it, these dams were used to collect water every year so that farmers could water their crops in the summer during the droughts, and people in California would have food.
Yeah.
And Canada, where do you think our freaking strawberries come from, people?
Yeah.
And then Trump just like released all this water. So that happened.
Yeah. Way to decimate your own food supply. Smart.
Yeah, right. As they were talking about in that clip, he fired the top 6 senior officials of the FBI. And like, I think what's really important for people to understand, because they're going after these agencies because people don't really understand it. Oh, I hate the police. Okay, but you fired the 6 senior officials of the FBI. These are not easy people to replace.
Yep.
They have years of intelligence experience, years of anti-terrorism experience.
Yep.
This is not a thing where you can just be like, okay, Pam, go hire the 25-year-old Doge bros to come in and they can be new FBI.
Yeah.
Which we'll also get to the Doge bags in a minute.
Yeah, you can't just take the QAnon shaman and make him the head of CIA, right? Like,
I mean, I'm sure Trump would try, and I'm not sure the Republicans would do fuck all about it.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and then, okay, I'm going to start. Sorry, there's just so much. Okay, so let's talk about USAID. So USAID is the foreign aid department, basically, that ensures, Ebola stays where it is, that kind of stuff. So first off, Musk went in and started shutting things down. They got into the payment system to stop payments, lawful payments, by the way, that were approved by Congress. And remember, USAID was not a government department that was just like spun up through executive order. It was created through Congress. In the US, Congress creates government departments, and it's only through Congress that these departments can then be shut down.
Yeah.
They put 2,200 staff on suspension, cut them out of their emails, remembering that some of these people are in like African countries with no way home, no idea what to do, and no access to their government email. So that's a thing.
Yeah, so they're just stuck, basically.
Yep, pretty much.
Yeah, well, way to abandon more of your citizens than just where the fuck ever, right?
Yep. So this is just an article talking about how a judge blocked that order and said, no, you can't put the 2,200 staff on leave. Yeah. So at least there's that glimmer of hope. However, and we'll talk about this again at the end. It's important to note that what happens if Trump says, okay, but what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
So I'll leave you with that. And we're going to watch 2 video clips now. The first one is from this week, Rubio defending the shutdown of USAID. And then the second one is a compilation by CNN of him not saying shut down USAID. So let's watch this one first. This is from just the other day.
I'll do it in English and in Spanish. First of all, it's great to visit here. This is, 25% of our capacity to fix airplanes in the Western Hemisphere. You're standing in the place that does it. And this is the kind of development that you need, not just to prevent migration, but to build a middle class in countries around the world, all driven by the private sector. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to come here, very friendly investment climate. President Bukele, who I've known for a long time, has done an excellent job of providing security and stability. This would not be possible without that. And has invited not just the existence of these companies, which have been here for a long time, but its growth, its expansion. And if you look at the jobs, these are the kinds of jobs we want to be creating in the United States as well. These are great, good paying jobs, skills, and it's the kind of thing that you hope to see more of, but all over the hemisphere. So it's a great, impressive place to visit. Es impresionante estar aquí hoy. Este es un sitio que el 25% de la capacidad de arreglo de aviones existe aquí en el hemisferio. Y si el trabajo y el tipo de industria que trabajamos, que no es posible no solamente que seguir expandiendo, masiva y questions. Well, look, I mean, my frustration with USAID goes back to my time in Congress. It's a completely unresponsive agency. It's supposed to respond to policy directives of the State Department, and it refuses to do so. So the functions of USAID, there are a lot of functions of USAID that are going to continue, that are going to be part of American foreign policy, but it has to be aligned with American foreign policy. I said very clearly during my confirmation hearing that every dollar we spend and every program we fund, that will be aligned with the national interest of the United States. And USAID has a history of sort of ignoring that and deciding that they're somehow a global charity separate from the national interest. These are taxpayer dollars. And so I'm very troubled by these reports that they've been unwilling to cooperate with people who are asking simple questions about what does this program do, who gets the money, who are our contractors, who's funded. And that sort of level of insubordination makes it impossible to conduct the sort of mature and serious review that I think foreign aid writ large should have. We're spending taxpayer money here. These are not donor dollars. These are taxpayer dollars. And we owe the American people the assurances that every dollar we are spending abroad is being spent on something that furthers our national interest. And so far, a lot of the people that work at USAID have just simply refused to cooperate. Are you currently in charge of USAID? I'm the acting director of USAID. I've delegated that authority to someone, but I stay in touch with him. And again, our goal was to go in and align our foreign aid to the national.
Okay, so he just keeps talking about how it needs to align. It's important to note those staffers he's talking about are people that Musk hired, mostly interns from his other company. Pod Save America were referring to them as Doge bags, which I think is great, and I'm going to continue. So these Doge bags are between the ages of 19 and 25. One had to resign because it was found that he had tweets advocating for eugenics and other horrible race stuff. Another one who they didn't get rid of was fired from a different job for selling company secrets.
Yeah, because those are the people you clearly want in positions of power, right?
Yeah, as we'll see later, somebody they sent these people into the Department of Energy too, and we'll talk about why that's terrible, but the people over there said, well, this is a bad idea. Yeah. But first, let's watch Marco Rubio talk about foreign aid when he was just a normal Republican. Hopefully this doesn't give us ads, but it might.
Now, Rubio spent years praising both foreign aid and USAID as a vital part of promoting American interest and American foreign policy. In fact, he's now basically echoing some of the attacks that he once dismissed. We found time and again across his 14-year Senate career that he was constantly praising and defending foreign aid. Let's listen to just a few of what he said over the years.
Okay. We don't have to give foreign aid. We do so because it furthers our national interest. That's why we give foreign aid. Now, obviously, there's a component to foreign aid that's humanitarian in scope, and that's important too. I promise you it's going to be a lot harder to recruit someone to anti-Americanism, anti-American terrorism, if the United States of America was the reason why they're even alive today. Anybody who tells you that we can slash foreign aid and that will bring us to balance is lying to you. Foreign aid is less than 1% of our budget. It's just not true.
Now, those comments paint a pretty clear picture, right? He said,
It's just not true. They're lying to you.
Yeah. Wherever
Do
heard
these
that before.
Republicans have like an ounce of integrity?
I mean,
Just an ounce.
yeah, because it's just so like you can't go into this position and say, oh yeah, I'm now Secretary of State. Yeah, fuck USA. And then like now, you in the past have defended it for so long. And the other thing, and like this is something we can absolutely talk. Like, tell me if you want to hear more, right? But like foreign aid is a policy instrument, right? It's something you use to like provide incentives to other countries in your interests. And like we were talking about this right before we like started recording about like there are instances of like, okay, well, I'm going to provide aid to like this country, I'm going to provide ships, but the conditions are you have to now sell me food at a lower discount, and you have to get your ships repaired in my country, right? Creates jobs for my country. I get food, you get ships. Overall, the benefit is to me, right? And foreign aid is part of that mechanism, and in such an interconnected and like globalized world that we live in, it's something that you kind of need to maintain your security, right? Like we were talking about this again before, where it's like you want Ebola to stay where Ebola currently is. You want flu outbreaks to stay wherever they originate because that prevents pandemics, Like it's a foreign policy tool that you use to make sure that those things stay there. But,
well, and like Rubio was saying, like he was absolutely correct. It's really hard to garner anti-American sentiment when you're over there taking care of people. Like China's already talking about swooping in. Why?
Because all of a sudden
For
it's
the
pro-Chinese sentiment. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's that. And then Musk did that deferred resignation program thing. Did you hear about that?
I did. Yeah, the thing where like you can either get bought out or like forced to quit, if I remember correctly.
Here's the thing. So people dug into this. He sent out an email. Well, somebody sent out an email titled Fork in the Road, which is the same one that he sent out to Twitter. So like, this is a Musk thing immediately. And what it said was, if you agree to resign at the end of September, you won't be privy to like the work back in the office, that kind of stuff, right? And we'll pay you till the end of September. But there was a caveat saying like, if your lead says you have to work, then you'll have to work that period of time. And then you just like, basically you're giving like 8 months notice. Yeah. But here's the thing with this. So the budget hasn't actually been approved. So like, there's no legality to them offering this because this is all congressional approval things. 40,000 employees have apparently accepted this offer. So we'll see what happens with that. Because what's to stop them from being like, okay, bye.
Yeah. Like you're paying me out, and like I just want to pick up the money and run, right? Like why would I stick around knowing that my job is just going to end? So
right. So we have that government restructuring. And now I'm going to throw this nuclear codes at you.
Oh,
just
great.
To
what a light and wonderful subject to discuss.
So much like the USAID, Musk sent people into the energy department's IT system on Wednesday, which like whatever. Maybe people don't understand why that's a big deal. So the energy department has the nuclear codes.
Yeah.
This is what I wanted to read. Members of the General Counsel and Chief Information Offices said, and I quote, "This is a bad idea because Ferrator hadn't had a standard background investigation needed to access the department system. He's one of the Doge bags."
Yep.
One of the people told CNN he's not cleared to be in DOE on our systems. None of these things have been done. This is like a clear issue of cybersecurity. Yep. The National Nuclear Security Administration is linked to this system. And it also, there was another article talking about how also in these systems, and this was really interesting, also kept on these systems are trade secrets of Musk competitors.
Yep. So weird. It's almost as if someone's trying to dig for information on his competitors so we can just squash it, right? Like, and again, I have lots of notes on this, but like the restructuring of government is basically just a step towards autocracy to benefit the oligarchy. And this is just, this is corporate espionage. You can't really say anything else about it. It's corporate espionage.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah.
The next thing I want to show you, this was a lovely Trump demand. CIA names exposure after Trump demands list via email.
Oh, I saw this one. Yeah.
Yeah. So the
Great way
White
to get all your
House.
assets killed.
Yeah, the White House demanded that the CIA send identity of agents, any like new hires. The problem is that this list also contains names of current CIA agents that are working overseas.
Yep.
So basically, and then they like talked about it. So basically they're like, hey, China, come hack us.
Yep.
Yeah. So, okay. So he's come for LGBTQ people, civil servants, FBI, military, people of color, immigrants, the disabled, and now CIA intelligence operatives.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which like are his own operatives, by the way. Like these are operatives operating specifically in American interests, deployed for American interests. And you're just naming them like
sorry, I'm trying to pull. This keeps jumping around. Stop it, stupid ads. Don't you hate this? Okay, here we go. The list contained the first names and initials of the surnames of CIA's new hires who are still on probation and thus easy to dismiss. So like, not even like code names or anything. It was just, here's the full names. Here you go.
Analysts who are hired specifically to focus on China and whose identities are usually closely guarded because Chinese hackers are constantly seeking to identify them.
Yeah, that was the next thing I was going to read. So like, this is a problem.
Yeah. You just gave up a giant intelligence asset. Well, a bunch of intelligence assets. So
yeah, who like, oh, by the way, you're fired now because
I don't like you. Like
because now you're compromised and you're useless.
Yeah.
So that's something that happened. Yeah. And there's more. We're almost done. Did you hear about this fun thing? Trump fired the chair of the FEC, which is the Federal Elections Commission.
Yep. Heard about that one.
She was a George W. Bush appointee whose term was not up. She's the current chair, and her job is to make sure elections run.
Yep.
So she's gone. She said yesterday she was on Rachel Maddow giving an interview. Her fellow commissioners, as of yesterday, had not been fired, but you know, who's to say that that's not going to be a Monday morning thing? Yeah.
Like we're basically again, this is very obvious. And can I start getting into this? Because holy shit, I got notes.
This was the last thing. So
cool.
Now you can get into it. And since I've been talking a lot, you can start us off on why everybody should be absolutely terrified about what is happening, because the bottom line is, and this is the last thing I'll say, they are trying to break it all.
Yeah.
Tell us why.
Yeah, and I have visual aids because
of course you do.
I've been reading since last night when I got home. So for those unfamiliar, I highly recommend this book here, The Dictator's Handbook. This is the updated edition that they wrote after the January 6th insurrection. Adds a solid chapter, very great book. And by the same author, The Logic of Political Survival, which is the technical manual which explains the math and case studies that they used to actually write the Dictator's Handbook. So the reason why I bring those up is because they're the logic of the books and the logic of like the researchers that wrote them is that often what you see in the transition from democracy to autocracy is a series of steps, right? Like first you come to power, then as soon as you're in power, you start purging positions and people that aren't loyal to you, and you start inserting people that are, right? So your main strategy is just to start culling supporters from like previous regimes, and you start installing your own cronies. You make sure those people are beholden to you. So in this case, Donald Trump signed an executive order saying, we're going to start transitioning a bunch of positions to be direct presidential appointees, right? Which is almost word for word out of Project 2025. So this is just one step because all these positions now that are used to maintain power within a system are now all directly beholden to the president. Now, in the books, they refer to these as the winning coalition, like the people that you specifically need the help of to both gain and retain power. And this is that, right? Like this is Donald Trump shrinking the coalition down, getting rid of a whole bunch of positions, making it easier for him to maintain power because all of a sudden, instead of having to, keep 25,000, really high level government employees happy, he can cut that down to say like 20,000, 15, 10, right? Then all of a sudden it goes from this huge bureaucracy that you need to keep happy and like full of people that are influential throughout the entire system. You shrink that down, and all of a sudden you depend on basically just the president, his cabinet, and the House of Representatives as it currently stands, right? So you go from a coalition of like several thousand, potentially hundreds of thousands and millions of people to you try to whittle it down as much as you can to basically be, as little as 6 is some examples I've seen to as much as like 63, right? So like it really should be alarming because these are major structural changes to the US government that make it harder over time, harder and harder to change leaders or governments, right? So, and bear in mind that the Electoral College is also specifically made so that a president can lose the popular vote, but still win the election like it happened in 2016. Or even before that, you look at George W. Bush's second term. That's what happened there too.
Trump's the first Republican in literally decades to technically win the popular vote.
Yeah, which is shocking, right? And that should be extremely
telling.
Alarming. Yeah, because like your system for choosing the president then is basically set up so that the loser can win. And it's been that way for, almost 250 years. So you have this like transition towards authoritarianism that's happening like right before your eyes. We're seeing it happen in real time. And people are like, oh, no, this is government efficiency. I mean, this is neoliberal governance, like shoved into, government that basically becomes autocracy, right? Because if you look at a corporation is basically a tiny autocracy, right? You have a CEO or a president at the top who makes all the decisions. Maybe they're kind of beholden to a board of shareholders that they're also probably the chair of. So they make decisions throughout the organization based on what they want. And it just happens to be that their interests are aligned with their shareholders. But, take that away, take it to a smaller scale, say like a homeowners association, and all of a sudden it's a really tiny autocracy where you're not really beholden to shareholders. You're just like, you get the position, you're in power, you hold money and you spend it however you see fit, right? There's a lot to kind of unpack within the Dictator's Handbook and the Logic of Political Survival, but it should be alarming to anyone that we're seeing an actual like culling of supporters and so public too, right? Like this is someone who's just signing executive orders being like, nope, you're gone. And then you have, Elon Musk and all of like the buddies that Donald Trump had during his inauguration there waiting in the wings to just go in and start filling those positions, right? This is literal corporate American oligarchy taking over the presidential administration.
Yeah. I was listening to, I want to say The Bulwark this week, and they had an author on whose name currently escapes me. It might have been Anne Applebaum, actually. And they were talking about how it's like the entrenchment, right? So like he is making it so it's going to be really, really, really hard for the Democrats to basically unwind what he's done by entrenching himself basically everywhere, right? Like there's been talks of how anybody who is left in the civil service this week has been getting like loyalty tests.
Yeah.
That should terrify people.
Yeah.
But I think like the thing that people don't understand is that these types of governments often come out of democratically elected officials. So like, look at Putin. His first election was a democratic election. And people said, well, Putin won't do that. Yeah, like the KGB guy isn't going to be...
Former KGB operative isn't going to transition towards authoritarianism.
Like, okay, people. So, and then of course, what he started doing was chipping away using laws to entrench himself and basically make it so that he couldn't lose future elections. For example, let's go back to Trump. This week, they introduced the SAVE Act, which is an act where you now have to prove when you go to vote that you have citizenship, and your citizenship must, like that document has to match the name on your birth certificate.
Yeah.
So, first off, people aren't even thinking about, so like trans people, the law's set up so that it doesn't take like legally changed names. Yeah. And they said it was aimed at like trans people, which like also horrendous. Like you're allowed to legally change your name, fuck off.
Yeah.
But I think there might be a lot of women that might find there to be a major problem with this act.
Yeah, because you took
through, I don't know, marriage.
Yeah. And actually that's something they mentioned in the Dictator's Handbook too, is like you make it, if you want to stay in power, you make it harder for people to vote in a democracy, right? Yeah. So you cull the number of people that actually have a say, and that's a great example of the way to do that. Is all of a sudden like, well, now with like a huge chunk of women can't vote, trans people can't vote, anyone who's changed their name at any point in time can't vote. And like it could have just like, it may not have been even, hey, I'm a trans person. It could have just been like me as an example. Rio isn't my legal name. It's just a name everybody knows me by. Is it on my birth certificate? No. Is it on any of my like federal government papers? No. Like, but I still get like once in a while I get letters from the government that use Rio, right? Which is really funny because I'm like, oh, cool. They just caught on.
How'd that happen?
Yeah, I had no idea how it happened, but it happened, and I was like, oh, cool. Thanks for catching on. I'm not going to legally change my name. I like my legal name, but Rio is just like easy, right? And that should be terrifying because it's also just one step away from like, okay, well, all of a sudden women and trans people can't vote. What if you make us have black people can't vote again, or anyone who's a visible?
Well, and there's already suppression of minority votes in the U.S., particularly in Republican areas. Yeah. Viktor Orban is another example of somebody who did this, except that he went through it constitutionally and started changing the Constitution. Now in the US, it's much harder to change the Constitution. It requires a 2/3 votes of the state as well as a 2/3 vote in the Senate. Yeah. But Viktor Orban did kind of the same thing. He started like he got in democratically once, twice officially, but like
really
basically and he, as soon as he got in, he declared a national security emergency and an economic crisis. Sound familiar?
Yep.
And he had populist messaging, which is also another like, and don't get me wrong, that can happen on the left as well. We see that in I want to say Venezuela.
Yeah.
Same idea, just way far on the left. Communist China is another example of that. So democratic entry point, the erosion of laws. I was listening to, again, The Bulwark. I love that show. But George Conway was on there. People might know him as the moron that married Kellyanne Conway. He did I tell you his story about how like Kellyanne met Trump? He was talking about how like everybody has like who is in the political sphere has like responsibility in Trump, and like if you start getting into the nitty-gritty and blaming yourself, you won't be able to move forward. And he said like I have blame, I introduced the two of them. And the chick, the girl Sarah, was like, what do you mean? And he was like, yeah, I was supposed to sit on his condo board or whatever, and I didn't want to do it, and I was complaining about it so much that Kelly said she would do it. And so that's how Kellyanne Conway met Trump. So of course, immediately Sarah was like, so this is all your fault. Thanks, George.
Yeah.
But he's a well-versed lawyer, and he was talking about this week about how like, well, he's been democratically elected. He's now changing laws.
Yep.
Let's say the Supreme Court grows a pair, and remember, they have a conservative supermajority in the Supreme Court. So that might not be a thing anyway. But let's say they grow a pair and say, no, you can't do that.
Yep.
What happens if Trump goes, I'm going to do it anyway?
Yeah. And
What are you going to do?
Yep. And like, you know, it's funny you mentioned the rhetoric of like, you know, oh, national emergencies, because like that's not the strategy that you use when you're trying to set up an autocracy. Is you get the police and military on your side, and all of a sudden, and I saw this in your notes, and that's why I'm going to kind of like skip ahead so we can continue to talk about this. Is like the militarization rhetoric and like just so much of that, like, you know, we're going to increase police, we're going to increase, you know, military, all of that is part of how you maintain power within an autocracy, right? And like, you know, if the Supreme Court were to grow a pair and say, no, you can't do that, you know, what's to stop Donald Trump from being like, sounds like a coup is going on, better use martial law and the military to go in and eliminate the Supreme Court, right? And that's, you know,
which you won't even have to do. So this was a question that Sarah posed to George. She said, okay, but like, isn't there like the enforcement, like how does that get enforced? And he said, okay, let's look at like issuing marriage certificates. Say Trump issues an executive order that's like gay marriage is no longer a thing. And then the registry office, or whatever the equivalent of the registry's office is that's escaping me right now, says, okay, we're not going to issue this to you because Trump says it's bad. Well, generally what would happen is the US Marshals would go in and be like, you have to do this or you're going to be held in contempt and arrested. However, as he points out, they report into the DOJ.
Yep.
Pam Bondi runs the DOJ, and Pam Bondi reports to the president.
Yep.
So again, I say, what are you going to do about it? And that's presuming that the people that he's left aren't just white dudes that are just going to do whatever he says and ignore the law, which is why the first step is to entrench yourself in the civil service and get rid of people that have like a moral compass and in the US's case, an oath to the Constitution and not the president.
Yeah.
So this is why, for example, he has instituted Pete Hegseth, who is a Fox News host, into running the military as an example of
Hegseth.
Loyalist.
Hegseth, who I should point out, reached rank of major, which is like not insignificant. You're a field commander, but not someone who does like strategic decisions in the military, right? Like that's not someone who's at like general, like any sort of general level. Like, yeah, it's a very bad decision. And I really can't really stress that. This is also someone who's part of the nuclear command and control structure. And like you have
I don't know who's worse, the Doge bags or Pete Hegseth having them like I don't know, man.
Nuclear command and control. It's absolutely insane.
So to sort of like piggyback off of what George Conway was talking about, they came to the conclusion that, okay, well, it's going to have to be a people-led thing, which means turmoil in the streets. Okay, so let's look at that. let's look at media manipulation next. So we already have state news there, which is basically Fox News at this point, who's saying that he's done so much winning, the mainstream media just can't keep up with it. Which, you know, as Seth Meyers pointed out this week, if you're doing so many good things, you want the mainstream media to keep up with it. Like you want them to be talking about it. So there's that aspect. But then there's this idea of like silencing media, which when he came in, the first thing he did was threaten to pull the licenses of MSNBC and CNN. Now, ain't nobody shutting up Rachel Maddow, so that's been fine. But CNN, if you watch the way they're covering Trump right now, they have basically done a complete 180 in like language. They're not like obviously Fox News bad, and you can still go onto their website and like they have like an entire link that is all where you can like access every single executive order he's done and like criticisms, all that kind of stuff. But just the way they're covering general things. So for example, in December, they released a story. One of the podcasts I was watching went through and they pulled up a story on eggs. In the story from December on eggs, Biden's name was mentioned 17 times in this article. They pulled one up from last week where eggs, and back then, eggs were like $4 a dozen in the US. Now they're at $8 a dozen. He pulled up an article from this week from CNN about the price of eggs and did a like control find for eggs, Trump's name. Nothing. Nada, nothing. It was just like, oh, avian flu. Suddenly they're picking up on avian flu. And that might seem like really small, but controlling the media will control crowds for a little while. If the media is not reporting the asinine things that he's doing or like making people understand that no, everything he's saying is a lie. Like they're getting people to hate the USAID, like Jade, my niece, okay? I was talking to her via text the other day because she messaged me and she was like, Auntie, did you see that the foreign aid people in the US were giving $50 million in condoms? And I was like, that is a lie. It has been proven to be a lie. Stop getting your news from TikTok, Jade. But you know, she's young and 17 and dumb.
And using TikTok.
Sorry, Jade, if you're listening. She's not listening. But that's how he's controlling, right? Misinformation. And by the time people catch on, he's just going to be shooting them in the streets. Which he tried to do the first time. And the Secretary of Defense was like, you can't shoot protesters. I won't issue an order to shoot protesters. You think Pete Hegseth is going to say no?
Oh, absolutely. He's going to say yes, like 100%, because he was asked about it like point blank and he just deflected right away. Like,
oh yeah,
he
just said President Trump didn't issue an illegal order, which was Pam Bondi's response to that question.
President Trump wished to issue an illegal order, he said, immediately before President Trump issued several illegal executive orders.
And had already issued many illegal orders in the first administration that people were like, we're not doing that.
Yeah. And like, so it's like, in addition to like media manipulation too, like that's when you control the narrative like that. And like, you literally see this in Russia. And I think I talked about this
I was just going to say, yeah.
You see this in Russia where like, there's literally just, there's state news, that's it. And it's the state news that's controlled by Vladimir Putin in Russia directly. And like, as soon as they say something that like he doesn't like, suddenly they're off air. And then, you know, I also just want to mention that having that kind of media manipulation is like just the main hallmark of an autocracy. And then you use that to just tell people like, hey, yeah, you know, that's the way things really are. And it's like that joke I mentioned, I think, on the last podcast as well. Like, you have an American and a Russian in the bar, and the American's like, oh, yeah, you know, you Russians have to deal with so much propaganda. And then the Russian's like, yeah, but this is not as bad as the American propaganda. The American's like, we don't have propaganda. And the Russian guy's like, yeah, see what I mean? Like, that's what you're getting now, right? And like,
yeah,
you know,
I mean, TikTok, X.
Yep.
It's literally a propaganda machine.
Facebook,
which
too,
brings us to oral. Help me out, Rio.
Hold
Oligarchic. Thank you.
Yeah, hold on.
Oligarchic entanglement.
Yep.
Musk is basically controlling the narrative on Twitter.
Yep.
These people also tend to like get government contracts. But what's interesting is like Trump's just taking that to a whole new level. He's just like, here, be a government. Like he's not even like trying to hide it.
Yeah.
Putin tries to hide it by like keeping them at arm's length and just paying them money. And then when they get too annoying, he poisons them or throws them out a window.
Yeah. The amount of
Elon Musk
penetration
sent,
in Russia is fascinating.
I know, right? But Elon Musk sent literal cronies to jails after Trump emptied his jails into America, which, by the way, was really funny that he was talking about how he wants to get the criminals out of America when he was talking about how other countries dump their garbage in America. Like, talk about that hypocrisy. And then there's just this idea, like, if you go one step beyond that, of just like normalizing authoritarianism. If Hillary Clinton did any of it, Hillary Clinton had like a slightly kind of unsecured server that she was sending not important emails over.
Yeah.
And like it basically destroyed her political career.
Yeah.
What the fuck?
Yeah.
Could you imagine if Barack Obama did any of this?
Yeah. If Barack Obama did any of this, everyone would be losing their minds. But the fact that it's Donald Trump doing this, people are just like, it's Donald Trump, he's joking, right?
It's just Trump being Trump.
Yeah. But like, and I'm just going to shift us along further in our notes. This is the normalization of authoritarianism and autocracy, right? Like you make it easier to have these conversations like, oh yeah, you know, he's doing this, and you just keep doing it. And eventually at some point, like psychologically, like that's how it works. Like you just hear something enough that at some point your brain is like, yep, that's true. That's just the way it is, right? And then that media manipulation, X, Twitter, Facebook, X is Twitter, X, TikTok, Facebook, you know, Instagram nowadays too. Like, my God, do I get a lot of like pro-Trump things on my Instagram? It's kind of shocking. Like,
since what's his face was like, we love Trump now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed that on both Instagram and Facebook.
Yeah.
Now. Which is funny because Facebook wasn't like in Canada, they're not like, they don't want to show news and stuff because they don't want to abide by that law that the Liberals passed last year.
Yeah, where you have to pay.
Yeah, like news outlets and stuff. Yeah, so I don't even know what else to say about this. So I don't know if you have any closing thoughts, but like this is just fucking insane, and I can't believe Americans are this stupid.
So I actually have one more note. Perfect segue. Thank you for the setup. Because another thing to kind of be aware of, especially like in transitions to autocracy and like in autocratic governments, is an erosion of public education, right? Like what's really
like
common,
the dismantling of the education department.
Yeah. And like what's really common now, just as example, is like, you know, what was it? I think it's something like 60-75% of Canadians have a high school, or 65-75% of Canadians have a high school diploma. And in the States, that number is something like 65 or 67%, something like that. Like 2/3 of the population has a high school diploma. And like at one point under Fidel Castro, and this is mentioned in the Dictator's Handbook, Cuba boasted almost a 100% literacy rate. But any sort of like secondary or like advanced education was extremely rare to have. And the reason why is because you basically like, in an autocracy, you don't want or need highly intelligent people, right? You want people that are like just educated enough to do their jobs, but like not stupid enough that they're gonna like cut their own hands off using a hacksaw, right? Like you need them to be like just smart enough. Yeah, right.
But Pam Bondi is a great example of that because on paper she looks great. She was the AG in Florida. She actually had initially signed on to go after Trump for Trump University, but then got bribed and withdrew her charges. So like,
Yeah.
But on
Where'd all that
paper,
integrity suddenly go?
right? But on paper, she looks great. And like even in the confirmation hearing, she was saying all the right things. And they asked her, like, oh, is your loyalty to the president and the American people? And she was like, the DOJ is for the American people. Like, it's not that she doesn't know how it's supposed to work.
Yep.
It's that she's entrenched with a dictator now. And none of these people have any backbones, which like, okay, maybe I'm not done ranting about this because like I for the life of me can't figure out what's going through these Republicans' minds because they could impeach Trump like 10 times over in 2 weeks.
Yep.
But like I
They
can't
choose
figure
not.
out what they're so fucking scared of.
Yeah.
Like from my perspective, like how far before they're like, oh crap, my constituents might actually unseat me over this.
Yeah.
Because like in the US, they're the check on the president. If the president's doing illegal things like this, you impeach them, then you get JD Vance and he continues to do that and then you impeach him.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, keep in mind they didn't impeach him over the insurrection too, right? But like, and this is actually
yeah,
part of
but that
like,
was so
media.
close to January 20th that like he would have been out by the time that happened.
Yeah.
They should have moved on prosecuting him immediately. That was like a complete Biden fuck up.
Yeah.
But I can't figure it out. Like look at Rubio. Like 5 years ago, also a good
Pro
segue.
foreign
He was talking about not foreign aid. If you go back and watch, I watched this yesterday. I tried to find like an actual clip, but I couldn't. So you're all like saved. But he was debating Trump in the Republican leadership stuff back in 2014, I think it was. And Trump was talking about Gaza, about how you need to move everybody out and then you need to build it up and turn it into a resort. So Trump was talking about Gaza back then. Rubio was standing next to him and he was like, you're a lunatic.
Yeah.
You can't just do that. Like,
And now
what?
we're back to that exact rhetoric.
Yeah. And like Rubio's out there being like, yeah, this is a great idea.
Yeah.
So like, I don't like, I get it. People want to hold on to the power. So like that part I'm fine with, but like, do they just like think that Americans won't notice? Which I mean, I guess could be the case, but like there have been cases in US history where like every single state has gone red or blue. It's happened like once or twice. And I could see this being one of those times. So, or like the midterms that are coming up in 2 years.
Yep. Bear in mind that like Donald Trump has like the highest disapproval rating. Well, what was it? Going into office, he had the highest disapproval rating of any incoming president. And like he hadn't even started yet, right?
Yeah. And so like I don't understand. I don't understand with the system they have why Republicans are like, it's fine. Like they would be freaking the fuck out as they should if Obama did that shit.
Yep.
Like I can't fucking figure it out. I don't know. Do you have any last words on this? Because I'm so done.
I mean, I'm good to go to the next topic.
And the last topic.
And the last topic, yeah, because we got this is a heavy one. So
yeah. Originally I was gonna play like what he actually said, but I think by now like everybody's heard it. If you haven't heard it, I'll link the White House press conference like in the description. But actually, one thing I will show, and I'm gonna keep up because it makes me laugh, and this was, I don't know if you saw this. This was Susie Wild's face when he started talking. It's like, she's like, what the fuck?
yeah, that's like so clear. Like, we did not talk about this at all.
That is like the like mom side eye. Like, what the fuck are you doing right now?
Yeah, that is the angry mom, like you're in so much trouble when we get home, mister kind of look.
Right? Like, so if anybody did miss this, which I can't see how you would have, even if you live under a rock, a sitting president of the United States openly endorsed ethnic cleansing in Gaza. He came out, even, I don't know if you watched the press conference, but even Netanyahu was like, what did you just say? I mean, I'm going to run with it, but dude, what did you just say? So Trump came out and said that America's going to own Gaza. They're going to ship the people to Jordan and Egypt, which, spoiler alert, Jordan and Egypt were like, no, you're not. Fuck that shit. And the Palestinians were like, we're not leaving. That's our home.
Yeah, that's our land.
And if that's not bad enough, Trump wants to build it up for the real estate and make it a resort town, which I'm sure will be owned by the United States of America and not Trump.
Yeah. Mar-a-Lago Middle East edition. Anyone?
Like, and here's the thing, like, people aren't wrong about the whole like flooding the area with shit, okay? Like, Trump says a lot of stuff, but just saying this about the Middle East is a crisis in itself.
Yeah.
Like, this is batshit crazy.
Yeah.
Like, just you going out on a stage with Netanyahu and saying you're gonna do this?
Yeah. Who, by the way, like, Israel is a U.S. ally, right? And you're saying you're gonna like inflame a U.S. ally?
Genocide much?
Yeah.
And then just saying, so, okay, so here, let's bring this full circle right back around to tariffs. Trump wants to, the peacemaker wants to send troops into Gaza to rebuild it as a resort, take over the Arctic for the minerals, take over Canada also for the minerals, which I don't think I mentioned earlier, but one of the things hot mic'd from Justin Trudeau was like, yeah, he wants our resources, because of course he does.
Yeah.
He wants Panama for the canal because that's huge amounts of dollars.
Yep.
And he wants to tariff the crap out of his people so that he can fund all this. Like, at this point, I don't know why else he would want these tariffs. Like,
yeah. It's just imperialism.
How are you going to fund your imperialism otherwise?
Yeah.
And like, how often do we let him say, I'm going to take Canada? Oh, haha, he's just kidding. Like, how is Gaza now the line, which it kind of appears to be?
Yeah.
Like, is this the point when the world goes, like, even Russia and China, the UK, Canada, Russia and China were like, what the fuck is wrong with you?
Yeah.
Russia and China were like, you can't do that. And he was like, yes, I can.
Yep.
I'm going to send US troops in.
Yeah. And this is Russia and China. Russia, who has invaded its neighbor illegally, by the way. Like, just said, like, telling someone that they can't just send troops in. And he's just saying, yeah, well, why not? Right. And like, this kind of again ties back to what we were talking about earlier, like just the increased militarization and the rhetoric of just, you know, increasing militarization, like the use of the military should be extremely alarming, because that's a hallmark of autocracy, right?
Well, and this is like, okay, so this Gaza stuff is actually the perfect example of spin in like real time.
Yeah.
So Marco Rubio, immediately following this, jumped in to claim that no, he just means that we want to rebuild Gaza, which like didn't help when the next day Trump was like, no, we're going to make it a resort and I'm sending in troops. So like that kind of went out the window. And then Fox News immediately started spinning it as a brilliant negotiating tactic, a leader thinking outside the box, and that of course he doesn't actually want to ethnically cleanse Gaza. I don't know, like my initial thought on this was because like nothing's more rational than ethnic cleansing.
I mean,
and and here's the best part. In my like, see, this is how dedicated I am. I watched Fox News, for all of you people. Jesse Waters flat out suggested that if Jordan and Egypt won't take Palestinians, they should just send them to Greenland.
Yeah, because those Mediterranean folks aren't going to do so well in the North Atlantic, right?
Yeah, that's the problem with that, Rio.
I mean, I just wanted to point out, like, I just
No,
wanted
I
to point
know.
out the level of abject misery they're going to be stuck in. But like the deportation and like relocation.
I
is, like,
mean, them
opposite.
freezing to death is just probably a bonus for somebody like Jesse Waters who doesn't give a shit.
Yeah, that's probably what Donald Trump wants anyway, right?
The Five, which is a Fox News insano program, was arguing about. So this is what I don't understand. This show has like 4 people, like Jesse Waters, that crazy lunatic right judge, somebody else, and then Jessica Tavlov, I think is her name. She's like a super left-wing person. I don't understand how she stands being on there with these people, because the right-wing judge was talking about how like the US should just force Jordan and Egypt to take people. And she was like, you can't force, A, you can't force those people to leave. It's their home. And B, you can't just be like, no, Jordan, you're doing it. And she was like, yes, we can.
Yeah. How are you gonna make a sovereign nation do that? Right.
Right. So that's like how Fox has been spinning this, which I'm sure Trump is just like loving.
Yeah.
So I don't know. This is like an autocracy in the making. That maybe people will pay attention to, maybe they won't. It's fucking terrifying.
Yeah.
And anybody that's living in Canada should be terrified to be sharing a border with this insano project that's happening.
Yeah. I like the joke is that like it feels weird knowing that we're like living in what's eventually going to become the Cyberpunk 2077 universe.
Yeah.
Now it's like as I think about it more, I'm like, you know, it's like this weird hybrid of like Fallout, Cyberpunk 2077, and a little bit of 1984 mixed in. Right?
I've seen some American gamers make political jokes about us basically living in cyberpunk at this point.
Yeah, like we're literally just short of like corporate war, and then we're there. But like, I mean, given a long enough time frame, it might actually happen.
Right. Well, and the problem is like all of these things taken together legitimize an autocracy, right? Yep. Even the sort of non-action from Canada, not saying that we've been like totally silent, but like behind doors, Justin Trudeau's like, oh yeah, this is scary as shit and all of you should be worried about it. But like nobody's actually really saying that, right? They're like, it's just Trump. It's just Trump being Trump. And like, I get it. On the one hand, you can't have like the leader of a nation instill panic, because like it's not like he can go get on TV and be like, well, I hope you all have the rifles we've let you have legally because the US is coming, bitches. Like, obviously you don't want to do that. But like giving normalization and legitimacy to this man is going to
dangerous.
It is. And like if the Democrats don't like step up their game and win the midterms and then literally have articles of impeachment ready to go for both him and JD Vance, America's fucked. And we aren't far behind.
Yeah. And like, yeah, I originally wanted to mention like on the topic of like invading allies, because apparently Donald Trump's now talking about putting boots on the ground in, you know, Israeli territory. Like,
yeah,
something
everywhere, Rio.
Yeah, like something I kind of wanted to like just touch on, and originally I wanted to like talk about a lot more, is that like generally speaking, democracies tend to not fight each other, right? Like if you look just historically, that's not what they do, and it's not because like they both like share the same values and the stuff they believe in. It's because in the Dictator's Handbook, they mentioned this. Generally speaking, they tend to be like democracies tend to have well-trained, well-equipped militaries. And you can't really be certain that you'll win against another democracy who is like of similar capacity, right? Which is, if you really think about the like doctrine of like mutually assured destruction and like nuclear deterrence, it makes a lot of sense, because like France, the UK, they have nuclear subs. So like, you know, even if the US were to say turn on France and the UK, they still have nuclear subs. And like, you know, NATO means we can kind of share information, but if that goes out the window, where does that information go, right?
Right.
And the reason why I bring that up is because like what ends up happening is bigger democracies with bigger like governments, bigger governments, bigger like militaries, bigger like GDP, tend to bully smaller democracies with policy, right? And that's where the tariff stuff like loops back to. Like it's a way to bully a smaller government and a smaller like democracy into the policy concessions that you want. And like there's something to be said about the Weinberger and the Powell doctrines of the US Armed Forces, which like for anyone unaware are basically like a series of questions that like the US command and control structure has to like answer before they commit fully to an invasion or like a boots on the ground kind of operation, right? And like one short version is that like, especially the Powell doctrine, because that one's a lot shorter, it's 10 questions. It's like, have we exhausted all of our other political like options? You know, is this within our national security interest? You know, those kinds of things that you need to be aware of. But the fact that we now have a US president who's like so openly about like, yeah, I'm going to put boots on the ground in Israel, boots on the ground in Greenland, boots on the ground in Canada, should be extremely alarming, right? And like, that's not normal rhetoric to have. And especially when you're talking about like annexation and like taking over like sovereign countries now. And like, yeah, it's not likely that you'll actually end up seeing a hot war, but it's entirely possible that you'll just see like, you know, massive, like basically just bullying, like economically and politically to get the concessions that he wants.
And
Like,
maybe some ethnic cleansing in the Middle East.
exactly. Yeah. And like he's using policy basically to accomplish all of this instead of like doing what he like clearly wants to actually do, which
like
is military interventions.
Yeah, which is sort of your more modern day way of doing this, right? Like I am going to talk, like I said, I'm writing a web series on the rise of autocracies around the world, and I'm going to be starting with Hitler.
Yeah.
And I guess that's kind of where that fork in the road is, right? Like Hitler then, well, I mean, not even, right? Because Hitler wanted expansionism for his people, because he saw that as German strength. So like maybe it's not so far-fetched. But I think the difference is that left versus right, right? Because Hitler was a socialist, a very racist socialist, that wanted land and resources in theory to make things better for what he viewed as legitimate Germans.
Yeah.
Whereas Trump, he just wants other people's land because he thinks in his little tiny brain that that will somehow not so much that, but like he's a lame duck, right? So I think in his like 82-year-old rotting brain, this is like a legacy, white man legacy bullshit.
Yeah, very much like Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine has been like,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like, it's a legacy piece because he's trying to restore the Russian Empire. It's Donald Trump trying to build a legacy piece by rebuilding the American Empire, not realizing that the American Empire already spreads around the world in the form of capitalism, right?
And also the whole making more money thing, because like I would love to see the ownership papers of Gaza if it ever gets that far, and I bet it's not going to be the US Treasury. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
So do you have any other like last thoughts on that?
I do have some last thoughts in general, but not on specific to Gaza. So.
Okay, no. Give us your last thoughts and then I'll do my show close.
Okay. Yeah. For me, and this is just like me kind of being like, hey, policy alternative. Like I think like, especially considering we now have like a president who's just so openly talking about like invading our country, like Canada really needs to like A, shore up its alliances with Europe, because like just smart idea in general, and B, we also need to talk about the fact that like our military is less than 100,000 like active service personnel, like, and that's between reserve and active duty. I think I did like I checked the numbers this morning. I'm pretty sure it was like 67 active and like 23,000 reserve, or it was the other way around, where it's 23,000 active and 67,000 reserve, which is absolutely insane to me that like we're a country of 400 million people and our military can't even sustain 100,000. Right? Like, so we clearly need something. And maybe, and like, yes, Donald Trump has a point that Canada has been lax on its defense spending. Like it's it's about 1.3% of our GDP, when the NATO target is 2%. But as a country, we should probably start looking at like, you know what, maybe 2 is a little bit low at this point. Maybe kick it to 2.5, 3%. Let's modernize, let's equip, let's build up our forces so that they're actually like adequate and effective. Because at the very least, it shows that like, yeah, we're committed to this alliance and we're committed to the treaty. And I can't believe I have to say this. It makes it less appealing to want to invade a NATO ally if you know that your NATO ally has a competent and capable force, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of just it, right? Like, I was looking at the numbers of the NATO forces combined minus the US,
Yeah.
which like is more than the US military, but like, how long would it take them to mobilize and then follow through with their treaty obligation to protect Canada from the... I can't even believe we're fucking having this conversation.
Yeah. And like, this is actually something really interesting too, is like, so NATO's been running drills on like how quickly it takes them to get like supplies to Poland, because like that's the Eastern Front with Russia, right? So like, but no one ever thought about like, what if we have to go west towards North America, right?
Yeah.
So, like,
although France did send planes to Greenland, so maybe we have some idea, because France was sick and tired of hearing Trump talk about it. So they were like, yeah, we sent planes, fuck off.
Yeah, military aid, right? And like,
yeah,
I think it's something like this is something that Canada should absolutely be
which,
looking
by
at.
the way, Greenland should totally kick out the US troops that are there right now and be like, you're talking about invading us, get the fuck out.
Yeah, like you already have military there, right?
Yeah, you have to leave because your president is talking about invading us. So we don't want no Trojan horses. Get out.
Which again, geopolitically, then exposes them like from the Arctic side.
Well, and what do you do, right? Like, it's a rock and a hard place.
Yep. So yeah, it's absolutely crazy that we're having this kind of conversation just like casually in 2025, where it's like, wow, yeah. Invading NATO allies by other NATO allies, which I should also point out is basically just
turning the Middle East into a resort.
Yeah, and like an invasion of NATO by a NATO ally is basically a declaration of war against the rest of NATO. So like, A, first of all, the treaty is definitely going to be fucking destroyed after that, and B, like,
100%.
Yeah, what does that mean for the rest?
If this was Obama, the treaty would have been like ripped up by now.
Yeah, the treaty would have been thrown out the fucking window and pissed on. Like, to be fair, it basically has been, but no one wants to acknowledge that yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this was fun.
Yeah. Want me to get my like last thoughts that I wrote?
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
Make
so
me more depressed, Rio.
Actually, this is just to make it like slightly less depressing.
Oh, yay.
I wanted to mention this in that so in the 2021-2022 edition of the Dictator's Handbook, they have a chapter at the very end that they wrote after the January 6th insurrection. And
yeah,
it
I heard
discusses,
you say that. That's interesting.
and it actually discusses whether or not like democracy is fragile. And in the book, they argue that like, no, it's not, because the institutions of a democracy tend to be a bit more resilient than the people that are within it, right? And from my perspective, that's like, I agree to a certain extent. Like, I'd say like, yeah, they're not like totally fragile, but they're so fragile that they still have to be defended, right? Because like, for now, and I really can't stress this enough that like, it's just for now, the processes and institutions that are built in to like prevent major changes that end democracy still exist. But that doesn't mean that they'll continue to exist forever, right? So like, any leader in a democracy, even if they're like a wannabe dictator or a wannabe autocrat, still has to survive an election. And like the House of Representatives and the Senate both have an extremely narrow majority. And again, Donald Trump went into this administration's presidency with the lowest or with the highest disapproval rating of any incoming president, right? Like, so clearly the taste isn't like, people aren't happy, right?
But the problem is that Viktor Orban also isn't loved.
Yeah, but
voter suppression methods, right? So like, I don't want to be all doom and gloom, and I know that you are like, let's end on a high note.
Yep.
It's going to rely on Americans getting the fuck out in the midterms and voting blue, picking out your Republican senators who are doing shit which, by the way, they clearly don't want their jobs anyway. So take them away from them.
Yeah. I mean, if you're sleeping in the Senate or like House meeting, like you probably don't actually want to be there. You're just there to collect a paycheck, right? And like,
yeah,
the separation of powers is what the United States was founded on because they were tired of being ruled by a monarch. Like, I don't think anyone really wants to be ruled over by another monarch. So like, Americans do have to be the ones to wake up and do it at the end of the day. So yeah, that was my last thought. And I'm going to just plug this because I'm very pro Dictator's Handbook. If anyone wants a really quick introduction, YouTube, like go on YouTube and look up CGP Grey Rules for Rulers and Death and Dynasties. And you basically got like the Coles Notes versions of the book. So like, yeah, go watch those and learn a little bit more because it's really interesting. And like, that's how I read this book. And then that's how I read 5 other books on the subject. So
all right, so we'll leave it there for today. Just a reminder, this is not normal. So people have to stay angry and loud. Vote in your midterms. They're in 2 years. Until then, if you are an American and you have a Republican senator in particular, maybe start calling their office.
Yeah. Maybe send a few angry emails, right? Like basic citizenship is they have to answer to you. So ask them questions.
And I think that with the Republicans, that's going to really be the only thing that's going to make them say something is if their constituents start saying, "We will fire you."
Yep.
So with that said, we'll be back next week with a show on the Arctic. So that should be nice and depressing as well.
Yeah, because who doesn't love Arctic security?
It's very relevant right now. So we'll see you guys all then.